So in true self, I place my attention on what? On awareness. I realize, who am I? I place my attention on consciousness. And I'm in devotion to the field of consciousness. And then I realize, and that field of consciousness is not just a field of consciousness, it's a field of consciousness, desire, and allurement. And I place my attention, I'm in devotion to my allurement. Because I realize that my unique self is my unique set of allurements. And so I need to actually be in devotion to my unique set of allurements, and my allurements allure me to you. Do you get that? My allurements allure me to that which is not merely my separate self, but to you, to she, to my communion, right, with my community, to my communion with teacher, to my communion with family, my communion with beloveds, my communion with the larger field. Homo, Amor, right, is actually in communion with the larger whole. So welcome. And we have a huge topic today. We have a huge topic. We're going to go all the way inside. And our topic is devotion. Devotion. Okay, it's a huge, wildly important topic. Devotion is a quality of Homo Amor. And I want to talk about devotion. How do you be fiercely independent, wildly autonomous, and radically devoted, right? That's the question. And you actually cannot live in joy. I can't live in joy. We can't live in joy without being in mad devotion. Now, devotion has its distortions, right? So devotion requires discernment. So I want to get distinctions around devotion. Okay. And by distinctions around devotion, right, what we mean is to understand the parameters of devotion, what it feels like, how it moves, right, in Homo Amor. But before we get there, before we get to distinctions around devotion, I want to first just invoke devotion. And David's going to read a code, and we're going to hear from Sally Kempton, for a moment. But first, let's just get devotion. We dismiss devotion. Does everyone get that? We dismiss devotion. Devotion is that which someone does when they're kind of not successful, right? Right? We say about, a man who's not quote unquote successful, we say, but he's a very devoted husband. But he's a devoted father, right? About a woman who doesn't meet society's standards of whatever society is expecting from her, whether in terms of success or beauty, right? And all of the tinsel expectations of a superficial society that hasn't yet found its heart and soul, that isn't yet birthed into Homo Amor. So we say about the woman, oh, she's a very devoted mother. Yeah, but she's very devoted, right? Who knows what I'm talking about, right? Devotion is a booby prize. And we identify devotion. Who gets this? Who gets this? And you go to your therapist, by the way, you go to your therapist or your friends and they tell you, oh, you're being taken advantage of, right? There's something dark, actually. Who gets this? There's something dark, right? And you can't really talk to a therapist about it because the therapist is operating usually at a particular level of consciousness, right? There's something dark, right, about devotion. You're somehow lost, right? Devotion is understood in some sense to be in opposition to dignity, right? And in modern therapeutic terms, right, as the hero of devotion, David, points out, right, in modern therapeutic terms, devotion is connected to codependency, which is the ultimate sin. And so we need to actually, right, we need to actually find our way to devotion that's whole, right? That's powerful, because again, here's the sentence: you cannot be in joy without devotion. Can't be done. Can't be done. No joy without devotion. And I want to just throw something in the space, and I want to read you something. Then we're going to turn to David and the code. Step one: reality is desire. Step two, desire is about devotion. My desire means there's something that's not yet here, right? There's something that's not yet here, and I want it, but I'm actually devoted in some sense to realizing it. But it's more than that. It's deeper. That's level one of desire and devotion. Level two of desire and devotion is much more apparent, and that becomes apparent particularly in sexual desire. And remember, parentheses, the sexual always models the wider field of Eros. So desire is a quality of the wider field of Eros. Desire lives across all fields of reality. Reality is desire. And sexuality models Eros. The sexual models the erotic. It doesn't exhaust the erotic. Sexual desire models desire. It doesn't exhaust desire. Now stay close, friends. It's deep. It's beautiful. So when you're in desire, what is desire arousing you? What is the characteristic of desire? The characteristic of desire is devotion. And if you've ever seen images, which I won't describe here in one mountain, but if you've seen images of people making love or people on their knees to God, and whenever you're on your knees, you're always on your knees to God, right? It's an act of devotion, right? It's the servicing of, it's a devotion to. There's a quality of devotion, right, in desire, right, in lovemaking, right, that is actually unimaginable. So I want to feel that, okay? Now, we're going to need to understand devotion in a very deep way. I want to not jump ahead now. Let's just begin. Let's just begin, right? Before we kind of put all the devotions on the table, let's just invoke devotion. Devotion and desire are fundamentally related to each other, right? And in the end, we're going to understand, powerfully that devotion is an expression of Homo Amor, and Homo Amor is unique self and unique self symphony. But what that quality of devotion means, I want to throw that on the table. There is no devotion outside of the context of unique self. There is no devotion outside of the context of unique self symphony. There's no devotion that's whole. So we need to get to a devotion that's whole, that's powerful, that's potent. And we need to avoid the pathology of devotion. But first, we need to take devotion back. Right? Let's just start there. Devotion is not per se a pathology. Devotion is a mad, gorgeous power of cosmos. And the very quality of divinity, the very quality of the infinite is that the infinite is, the name of God is, the infinite is the infinite intimate. The infinite is the infinite intimate. And the infinite is in devotion to the finite. Right? The infinite is in devotion to finitude. That's the paradox of the infinite, that the infinite is all powerful, radically powerful. Let's stay completely centered now. The infinite's radically powerful, radically alive, not in need, in any classical sense, at least, of finitude, of the manifest world. And yet the infinite is, the name of God is the infinite intimate. The infinite is in devotion to her intimates. Wow. So this quality of devotion. And let's begin with, before we kind of, run too quickly to devotion to myself, which is kind of the move we all make. Well, let's stop for a second, bracket the self for a second. Let's just feel devotion. Okay, let's just feel devotion. I want to read you something if I can. Right, I was reading this morning. I tried to print this out. So I may just kind of share something with you a little bit, personal, intimate, that and that I was thinking about early this morning. I went to do my doctorate, essentially, so my mother would be happy, right? Jewish mothers, sons, academic degrees, you know how that works. So I went to Oxford so my mother could, tell people, oh, my son is in Oxford and he's getting a doctorate. And that was like, I got some points with mom there. So that was good. And when I was in Oxford, I was in the college that had the library of Isaiah Berlin. So just, my guess is almost no one but just is there anyone kind of in the chat box who knows who Isaiah Berlin is? Okay, anybody? I know Elena does, right? Right. So Isaiah Berlin was Carol. Okay, yay, we got Carol. So no one should feel bad if you don't know who Isaiah Berlin is, right? But Isaiah Berlin is one of the most fascinating and brilliant, figures in contemporary philosophy. Not a rabbinic scholar. That's Chaim Berlin, Lane, right? Maybe his cousin, right? But Isaiah Berlin is one of the great dons of Oxford, one of the great philosophers, right, of the 20th century. Was also very involved in politics. And so I was in the library in Oxford that had Isaiah Berlin's books. Can everyone kind of get the scene? Can everyone kind of get the scene for a second? Try and get the scene. So I'm in Oxford. I'm surrounded by Isaiah Berlin's books, which have his writings, and they're kind of like crazy, interesting and kind of beautiful. And right, Isaiah, as in Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, right? Isaiah or whatever that is, Isaiah. Okay. So the prophet Isaiah Berlin. So I happen across, right, a book about how Isaiah Berlin goes, he's working for the British government. It's 1945, and he goes to Russia, all right, I think to Moscow. And when he's there, right, he asks, right, he wants to meet with a particular, he asks someone in a conversation, he wants to meet with a particular, Russian poet, right, whose name was, and I apologize if I mispronounce it, her name was Anna Akhmatova, right? I don't know if it's Ach or Akhmatova, right? I don't know if it's Anna or Akhmatova, right? The way the story is told that I saw, he was going to Moscow, but that's okay, right? So, and they tell him, right, that she's actually still alive. And so he goes to meet her. Okay? And there is a German writer who actually writes a story, right? He writes a story about the meeting, right, of Anna Akhmatova, right, and Isaiah Berlin, right? And they have this mad night together. It's not a night of sexing, right, but it's a night of Eros, right? And and they kind of fall madly in love with each other, I would say, right? But it's this incredible meeting, which takes place, I believe, in Leningrad, the way I understood it. But that's not the key to it, right? The most important thing is to clearly understand who Anna Akhmatova was, right? You have to actually understand that the way the West tells the story of World War II, it's the Western allies who defeated Nazism. But for many years, they skipped over the incredible and unimaginable suffering of the Russian people and the Russian army. I mean, just an unimaginable story of suffering and heroism, right, and bravery, which participated and was essential, right, in defeating Nazism. And it was only after, the Cold War thawed, right, that the Cold War, the Russia-West war thawed, right, that there was some beginning of a realization of what the devotion of Russia was. Right? Russia was devotion. Russia literally, became devotion. And Anna Akhmatova, right, writes a work, right? It's probably her greatest work. It's called Requiem, right, which is about this suffering. And I'm just going to read you just a little piece of it, right? It opens, right, with a 4-line poem, which is unmoved by the glamour, right, unmoved by the glamour of alien skies, by asylum in faraway cities. I chose to remain with my people where catastrophe led them, and I was there. And she tells many stories, right? She tells many stories, right? But included in them was her own suffering, right? Trying to protect her family, right, in Leningrad. Okay, so she writes, I'm going to read you directly from it, right? In the terrible years of the Yezhov terror, which I may be mispronouncing, I spent 17 months queuing outside the prisons of Leningrad. Okay, all right, so her just to get, a little bit of her story. Her first husband was executed by the secret police in I think 1921, right? Her third husband, right, and her son, right, spend many, many years in the gulag, right? And she queued, the word queued, meaning she would wait in these very, very long, freezing lines, right? Trying to deal with an impossible bureaucracy, trying to somehow protect them, somehow help them. So she writes, in the terrible years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months queuing outside the prisons of Leningrad. So just to get that, I just want you to get the image of devotion, right? This woman, right, who's outside the prisons of Leningrad, right, for 17 months, all day, right, all day from the beginning to the end, right, in line, right, in line in this, almost like in Kafka's Trial, these impossible lines and in impossible contexts. And then she writes, right, on one occasion, someone recognized me. It was a woman standing near me in line in the queue with lips of a bluish color, right? And then waking from that state of numbness, which was characteristic of us all, she quietly asked me, for everyone spoke in a whisper in those days, she quietly asked me, and can you write about this? And I replied, I can. And then something like a smile flickered across what was once her face. And then something like a smile flickered across what was once her face. Right? Like, wow. Right? And I've looked at, the lines of Requiem, which are about suffering, right? They're about suffering, right? They're about, right, the horror of Stalin, right? All mixed up with all of the brutality, right, of this impossible hidden time. And she's in devotion. She's for 17 months in queue. And her devotion is both to her son, right, to her husband, but her devotion is also to the writing. She's going to write. And she's writing in devotion. And she's not writing because she's going to get published tomorrow. She's in devotion to goodness itself. She's in devotion to truth. She's in devotion to beauty. She's in devotion to the word. And she has this trust that her devotion to the word has dignity and ultimately will bear fruit. And so I came across her, just sitting, writing about Aramaic texts, all night and all day. I wrote the doctorate kind of surrounded by Isaiah Berlin's books. And Isaiah Berlin meets in 1945 and spends a night, but again, a night of Eros, not a night of sexing, a night of radical Eros, right? In which Berlin is actually young and naive, and she's older and wiser. And yet there's this impossible meeting that takes place. And so she's always been a symbol for me of devotion. And so I want to begin with that kind of devotion. We'll get to the later stages of devotion, right? Right. But I just want to just feel devotion. I want to feel devotion with you. Yeah. So David, give us our code, brother. Here we go.
Thank you, Dr. Mark. Feeling into that devotion here every week that we gather here at One Mountain. Here's our evolutionary love code for today. Reality is desire. Desire is devotion. Devotion is the placing of attention. Homo Amor is devoted, but the devotion of Homo Amor is fundamentally different from the devotion of Homo sapiens. Devotion shows up in one way in the pre-modern period. Then there's the devotion of modernity, which is followed by postmodernity's deconstruction of devotion. The new story of value, cosmoerotic humanism, reclaims devotion at a higher level of consciousness. Devotion shows up differently as separate self, as true self, as unique self, as evolutionary unique self, and in evolutionary unique self symphony. Devotion shows up differently at each of the three stations of love. Indeed, evolution is the evolution of desire. The evolution of desire is the evolution of devotion. The evolution of devotion is the evolution of love, and the evolution of love is the birth of Homo Amor. I turn my word back to you, Dr. Mark.
Wow. Wow. And I'm going to stay with my picture off. I'm going to stay off. I'm going to go directly to Krista, and we're going to hear just for 3 minutes, Sally Kempton, right? The great teacher, Sally Kempton. Swami Durgananda is a powerful feminist, a powerful stander for the feminism, a powerful, holder, a powerful voice against abuse, right? A powerful voice for the dignity of the feminine, right? And Sally, right, writes and talks. Sally talks about devotion. So let's hear for 3 minutes an incredible, just little piece from Sally Kempton, our dear, dear friend, and one of the powerful woman who stood right with the center for so many years. Sally Kempton on devotion.
My life in yoga has really pretty much unfolded, and it's one of the ways that I believe that you're on a path that is true, is that it's almost as though you're drawn to the next thing. So even though, for instance, if I had been designing a path for myself, if I had been going to say, okay, what spiritual path fits me, as a sort of postmodern, not intellectual, but very much intellectually centered person, I would be a Buddhist, because, it's non-sectarian, there's no use of the G word, and I came from a very non-religious family. How did I end up as a Hindu? It's not like me, and yet the devotional, colorful, very personal, and yet philosophically broad, the quality in Hinduism that has really one of the highest non-dual teachings in world spirituality, and yet completely has a place for personal devotion, chanting, stories. In other words, I would never have chosen that on purpose, but that was what drew me. And even the devotional quality that's very important in my spirituality, I met this teacher. He opened my heart to that experience that I had seen in the beginning. And he was a devotional person, he worshipped God as Shiva. So because I trusted him, I allowed myself to open to the idea that there actually is, a theistic quality in the world, and that somehow devotion and the feeling of love that I was seeking are married to each other. Somehow there's a very personal quality in the love of the universe that we may experience through our relationships with each other, but which we experience in a kind of meta way when we actually conceive of a personal deity, a God form, who we can be in relationship with. That's a very, very radical idea for a left-wing humanist like me. I was never a Catholic. I never had any connection to Western religion. So the idea of devotion as a path, of bhakti as a path, completely just unfolded itself for me.
And can you feel this, everybody? And it's why I chose, right, this particular clip. And thank you, Krista, for reminding me of it, right? It's called My Life in Devotion. My Life in Devotion. And Krista, I asked you to meet. You had a beautiful meeting with Sally, right, before she passed, right? Devotion, right? My life in devotion. And if anything characterizes Homo Amor, it's devotion. And I want to ask friends, beloveds, I want to ask us to don't jump so quickly like we did in the beginning. The first quick move is I'm devoted to me. So I get that, and that's important. And I said earlier, true devotion lives in the context of unique self. And Sally's life was a journey towards that realization. And Sally and I spent many, many hours deepening this unique self-realization together. But let's get there first. Let's first claim devotion. Okay, let's claim devotion and not be afraid of devotion. Like being a devotee is the word that we today associate with a cult, with a pre-personal abusive cult. That's where you're a devotee. That's tragic and not true. Of course, you can pathologize devotion. Of course, there are degraded forms of devotion, but that's not what devotion is, right? Devotion is stunning. And my life is devotion, and I'm in devotion. I'm in devotion to everyone, right? That's in our circle. I'm in deep devotion, and devotion to she, and devotion to our mission, and devotion to the community, and devotion to individuals in the community. But when I say I want to be very specific, right? Not I'm committed to, I'm in devotion to. I want to feel that quality, and that devotion is not in contradiction to my autonomy. It's not in contradiction to my fierce sense of irreducible uniqueness, nor should it be in contradiction to your fierce sense of irreducible uniqueness. So let's discern, let's understand devotion, okay? And let's maybe step back for a second, and let's try and kind of take a broad view. Okay, so one, in our broad view, I want to start it kind of phenomenologically. Does that word make sense to anyone? I mean, I want to describe devotion, and then I want to kind of look at its evolution, at its emergence. What's the quality, right, of devotion? Let's describe it together. So devotion is, we began with, devotion is an expression of desire. The depth of my desire, the more I desire, the more I'm devoted. The more I desire to be in union with the good, the more I'm devoted to the good. The more I desire to be in union with she, the more I'm devoted to she. The more I desire to be in union with the true, the more devoted I am to the true. So for example, I read once a beautiful set of paragraphs written by Steven Weinberg on muons, M-U-O-N-S, muons, these subatomic particles. And Weinberg was in devotion to muons, right? The devotion of the scientist to truth, to the quality of truth, the kind of radical devotion, right? The devotion to beauty, but not beauty as a kind of tinsel beauty, not beauty as pseudo-eros, not devotion to pseudo-eros, but devotion to eros itself, the beauty that includes all contradictions. The beauty of, I remember my friend Maury, a woman I was madly in love with. We lived together in the same house in separate apartments. We did dinner together every Friday night, but we never had any physical contact. When I met her, I was about 31. She must have been 80 or 85. And she was this very old Moroccan Yemenite, I don't actually remember the source, woman who had come to Israel when the state was founded. Her children had abandoned her, and we happened to be living in adjoining apartments, right? And, you know, her wrinkled face was the most beautiful face you could imagine. And I was in devotion to Maury, and Maury is her name, right? Devotion, right? Devotion means, right, I show up no matter what, right? Devotion means, right, I arouse myself out of my torporitic slumber, right? And I find my aliveness, and I place my aliveness on the altar of she for the sake, right, of a greater wholeness, for the sake of manifesting the most beautiful world, the most good world, the most true world that we've always known, right, as possible. The pure joy of devotion, right? The trembling aliveness of devotion, right? The showing up, right? And I'm just to feel that, the mad delight of devotion. And there's a steadiness to it. It's steady. I show up even when I don't feel like it. Right? It's steady. It's consistent, right? You can rest, right? When you can rest when someone experiences devotion and someone in relationship to you is in devotion, you can rest in that devotion. And again, I want to say it right, just from my perspective, right? I'm devoted to people, and people know they can rest in my devotion, right? As long as I'm alive, I will try and show up and be committed forever. And in mad devotion, even when it doesn't make sense and when it's politically inappropriate and it's economically, borders on ruinous, right? But we're devoted. We're devoted. We show up. We're in devotion, right? When you cook food, when you cook food, you can taste food that was prepared in devotion, right? You can taste food that was prepared kind of efficiently, right? Or the food that's prepared in devotion. We're in devotion to each other, right? It's like, yes, right? We are devotional beings. And before we run to explain that it's devotion to me, we'll get there. Yes, I got it. Devotion only exists in the context of unique self. Yes, that's true. But before we get there, let's just feel this quality of devotion. Yes, there are people who abuse devotion, right? Yes, there are false voices of devotion in us, right? That move us to be devoted to that which doesn't deserve our devotion. Yes, I need to be discerning and on what altars to place my devotion. Yes, that's all true. That's all true. Because after all, isn't jihad a false devotion? Of course it is. So we're going to need to make distinctions around devotion. But first, my friends, let's breathe in that quality of devotion. We keep our commitments, right? And I made a commitment to Terry last week, right, that we would talk before our meeting this week, right? So I thought about that when I woke up this morning. I have not fulfilled that commitment. So I'm going to ask Terry if he can meet with me tomorrow at 3:00 Eastern time in devotion. Okay, so we'll be in devotion. Okay, devotion means we keep our commitments, right? We keep our word, right? In the best way we can. If we don't, we notice it, and we recommit and we recovenant. Okay, that's devotion. So let's go deeper, okay? I'm going to say part 2, but I don't know what part we're up to. So let's call it part 4, just for the heck of it. And maybe Elena, you'll split it into parts, and maybe this will come out to be part 4. Who knows? Okay, who knows? Okay, we ready? Okay, so let's look at pre-modern devotion, modern devotion, and postmodern devotion. So pre-modern devotion is generally devotion to a religion, right? Devotion to a religion in which there's a God or a religious authority at the center, and I'm fulfilled through my devotion at best, but often in pre-modern devotion, it meant giving myself up. It meant an abnegation of self. It meant a degradation of self. In the best situations, it didn't, but for the masses, devotion was part of the unfulfilled realization of the human potentiality of a fully dignified self that was independent of what were often superficial and misplaced devotions. Okay, so devotion was both a beautiful quality of premodernity, but also a quality that was often pathological because the self wasn't realized. The self, actually, Anthony Storr is a British psychoanalyst, a very good British psychoanalyst, a very good thinker. And he writes a book which I must have read decades ago called Solitude, right? And he has a section of the book where he traces the word self. Now, the word self first appears in the dictionary in the Renaissance, right? In the kind of center of gravities, right, of Western culture, right? So actually, right, to have real devotion, I first need to be a self. So we move into modernity, okay? So in modernity, the locus of devotion shifts from devotion to religion, devotion to king, right? To country, to kingdom, right? To empire. Those are the loci of premodern devotion. Devotion to a God who's dissociated or at least separate from reality. God's outside of reality. I'm in devotion to that God. And that's not wrong. It's just limited. But you've got to begin with understanding that this pre-modern notion of devotion wasn't just a deception, right? It was also speaking to a very deep realization deep inside the anthro-ontology of a human being. Anthro-ontology, the human ontology knowing of the nature of existence, which is we're in devotion. Right? In the text of the Western canon, right, called Genesis, there is Adam and Eve, who are archetypal, mythic figures. And then there's Cain and Abel go to offer sacrifice. And sacrifice, I'm offering something up. I'm in devotion. So then if you read the text, you notice there's no command to sacrifice. Why are they offering sacrifice? No one asked them for a sacrifice. So the impulse to devotion, right, lives deep inside of me. And the word for sacrifice in the original Hebrew is korban, and korban means intimate closeness and sacrifice. Intimacy and sacrifice, because there is no intimacy without sacrifice. There's no intimacy without devotion. You can't be intimate without being devoted, right? I'm devoted, right? We're devoted to each other, right? As I walk around the house here with Christina, we're devoted to each other. Zach, we're devoted to each other in a different way. Devotion. It's beautiful. Okay. So modernity, the locus of devotion shifts. Does that make sense, friends? Devotion shifts to a devotion to the physical world and to the knowing of the nature of the physical world. It's a new devotion. And so we shift to measurement, which is a desire to know, to understand. There's a devotion, right, to truth. I want to know the truth. I don't want dogma. I want to know the truth. And there's this deep, and science is animated by the eros of this new devotion, this devotion to truth, this devotion to facts. There's this devotion to facts, right, to the stories of science, right, the factual stories of science. And there's a devotion which begins to my own interiors. That's called psychology. Right? I want to actually go inside myself and kind of know what's going on inside of me. Okay? So that's the devotion of modernity. Postmodernity deconstructs devotion. Because postmodernity says there are no stories that are true. There are no values that are real. They're all socially constructed. There is no essence to be devoted to. That which I was in devotion to is really an ephemeral myth, a figment of my imagination, a social construct, a fiction. Those are the words used by postmodernity classically. So postmodernity says deconstruct your devotions. Your devotions are degraded. It must be some power move that someone's making. You're naive. Someone's taking advantage of you. Someone's taking advantage of you, right? They're actually exerting power over you by demanding your devotion. But actually, if you would actually grow up and be mature and go to therapy, you would actually, right, liberate yourself from these degraded devotions. Does everyone get that? It's big. That's postmodernity. So postmodernity deconstructs devotion. Now, we need now to go, and I'm so excited to be with you. I'm just ecstatic to be with you. Thank you. We need to go postmodernity, right? In other words, postmodernity in the meta-crisis. And that's the breakdown of devotion creates the meta-crisis. Meta-crisis is an expression of the breakdown of devotion. And that's the opposite of devotion is the generator functions of the meta-crisis. And what are the generator functions of the meta-crisis? Someone fill it in for me. Rivalrous conflict, governed by win-lose metrics. It's every relationship is actually a hidden expression of rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, which is the polar opposite of devotion, right? Which is why anyone who's devoted is a fool. That's how we began. Did you begin to get that? And then rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, which governs all of the relationships in society, all the way up and all the way down, economic, political, social, psychological, right, technological, generates fragile, complicated systems. And a complicated system means that the system is fragile. It can break down. It's optimized for efficiency, not for resiliency, because there's only resiliency if there's devotion. The parts have to know each other and they have to be in devotion to each other, right? And when I use this example often, when I create an instrument, right, a financial instrument, right, someplace in the world, then it ripples through the world markets, wreaking destruction. It's because the people that created the financial instrument and they put it into play in the currents of world markets are dissociated. They're non-intimate with the broader swaths of reality that they're impacting. They're operating based on rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. There's no devotion, right? So these are the generator functions for the meta crisis. And underneath both of them is a collapse of intimacy, right? In other words, intimacy, right? Intimacy arouses devotion, right? So the meta crisis is an expression of a crisis of devotion. But there's a reason there's a crisis. It's for good reason, because devotion got pathologized. Devotion got hijacked, both in premodernity, right, and in the success stories of modernity, where I'm devoted to science, I'm devoted to my inner psychology, and then devotion becomes pseudo-erotic. I'm devoted to success. I'm devoted to my own emergence for its own sake. And it's a separate self-devotion, which actually has a bad fragrance. I become egoic, but egoic not in a healthy ego sense, not the healthy ego that differentiates and that has its own sense of parameters and boundaries, but I become in service to one thing only, to my status, to my power, to my superficial expression, not to my authentic expression. I become devoted, right, in a pathological way. So we need to reclaim devotion. So postmodernity comes along and it deconstructs the absurdity of kind of the personal devotion of the success story, but it also deconstructs the systemic devotions of kingdoms and religions and philosophies and ideologies. And postmodernity is important. It's why I consistently disagree with my colleague Jordan Peterson, who mocks postmodernity. We need to deconstruct devotion, right? Is that right, Talia? We need to reconstruct devotion in order to then resurrect devotion at a higher level of consciousness. Does that make sense? Does everyone get that? So now let's resurrect devotion. Let's have a drum roll. Who's up for the resurrection of devotion? Let's resurrect devotion. Let's resurrect devotion. Let's reconstruct devotion. Who's up? Are we in? Right? Are we willing to play a larger game here? That's what we're here. We want to retell the story. Let's play a larger game. Let's reconstruct devotion. Let's resurrect devotion. Let's evolve devotion. So devotion, right, is a quality of Homo Amor. So Homo Amor, the movement, the new human, the new humanity. Homo Amor, which is the realization I'm not just Homo sapien, I'm actually Homo Amor. So what is that realization? So number one, I'm not just separate self. And my devotion is not just a psychological personality devotion of separate self, which is very easy to have that hijacked or distorted. It's very easy to manipulate that, that devotion in ways that are abusive, which we have no tolerance for. But there's a deeper devotion. And that's the devotion. Let's start. First, I go from separate self to true self, right? And the devotion of true self is the realization that we live in the field together. So there's this devotion to the field itself. And it's this devotion, right, to awareness, to the realization of my true nature as awareness. So in the devotion of, now let's go slow, in the devotion of true self, I place my attention on my awareness. And I want to add this sentence, and I'm not going to talk much about it this week, we don't have time, but the nature of devotion is the placing of attention. When I'm devoted to you, I place my attention on you. Right? Devotion is a quality of love. It's a quality of Eros. And the nature of Eros, the nature of love, is the placing of attention. That's why the sexual models the erotic, because the essence of the sexual is the placing of attention. Does everyone get that? In the sexual, I place my attention. That's why we're excited by the sexual. Now, the hijacking of the sexual, right, the movement from the erotic universe, right, to the pornographic universe is the movement from eros to pseudo-eros, and it's the hijacking of attention. So we're going to come back to that at a different moment. The pornographic universe, whether it's in sexuality or in social media, but they're both expressions of the hijacking of my attention, which actually deconstructs my capacity to have devotion. And the reason social media demarcates the postmodern world is because the postmodern world has deconstructed devotion and the postmodern world has deconstructed attention, right? And that's for the postmodern world, there's nothing to place attention on, right? In the pre-modern world, we place attention on the divine, right? In the modern world, we place attention on psychology and science, on the inner workings of the factual realities. And the postmodern world says there is no field of value, so there's nothing to place attention on. So devotion expresses itself in attention, but postmodernity says there's nothing to be devoted to and nothing to place your attention on. And so the exteriorization of the interior experience of the postmodern mind is called the internet, in which there's constant interruption of attention, right? Attention's constantly being hijacked, constantly being stolen. It's the internet is the structure for the scattering of attention. But if you scatter attention, you can't be in devotion. You can't be in devotion to truth, and you can't be in devotion to goodness, and you can't be in devotion to beauty. It's why people jump from teacher to teacher, from project to project, from cause to cause, from reading to reading, because I can't actually stay. I can't focus. I can't stay inside, right? One of the things we say to each other when we actually start a real process of being together, right? Let's say in Holy of Holies, we say we're here forever. We're here forever. As long as you'll be here, I'll be here. We're here forever together. Whatever that means. And of course, forever means you can leave whenever you want, just to be clear. Anyone who wants to leave can leave whenever they want. But I'm here forever. We're in devotion. I'm in devotion, right? You choose your devotion, right? But there's a forever quality. And forever quality doesn't mean, you can have a right distance, right? You can step in, step out in different ways. But basically, there's a fundamental, if you're really inside, there's a fundamental forever quality. Right? Whenever devotion is placed, there's got to be a forever relationship. Okay, parentheses, by the way. I've written about sexuality, and people assume I have a liberal position on sexuality. I do not. And I do not. I don't think there should be sexuality in the world, right, unless there's some sort of forever commitment. Now, that forever commitment might not be marriage. That's one kind of forever commitment. But sexuality is not casual. The second I'm devoted to and I've placed my attention on you, that means there should be connection between us of some kind forever. Okay? So what we now need to do is let's now come back together. Let's come back together, everyone. Let's come back together. It's so beautiful. So what is we not to, we know we want to resurrect devotion. We want to re-express devotion. We want to reclaim devotion. Okay, so here we go. So Homo Amor, the quality of Homo Amor is the quality of devotion. Devotion is the placing of attention. That's what it is. Devotion is the placing of attention. So in true self, I placed my attention on what? On awareness. I realize, who am I? I place my attention on consciousness. And I realize that my true nature, tattvam ase, thou art that. My true nature is consciousness. I place my attention on the quality of consciousness. And that's the quality of true self. It's beautiful. And I'm in devotion to the field of consciousness. But that's just the first step of resurrecting devotion. If you stop there, devotion wilts and dies, because we're more than consciousness, because consciousness is the beginning of the inside, but it's not the inside of the inside. So if there's Sat and Chit and Ananda, the terms from Kashmir Shaivism, from Hinduism, Sat is being and Chit is consciousness. So the inside of being, Sat, is Chit, the inside of being is consciousness. Then the inside of Chit is Ananda, and Ananda is allurement. It's the play of allurement. It's the play of desire. So actually, I want to place my attention, and this is when I move, I want to place my attention not just on awareness, I want to place my attention on allurement. Allurement. That's the move from true self to unique self. Move from true self to unique self is not a regressive move. I'm not moving backwards to separate self, level one. Level two, right? I have a healthy separate self. I've now transcended. I end the trance of being just separate. I end the optical delusion of consciousness, which is the thinking that I'm separate. I realize I'm true self, and that true self is the singular that has no plural, but that I am actually not separate from the field of consciousness and awareness. And then I realize, step three, level three, I realize I'm actually an irreducible, unique expression of that field of consciousness. And 3A, and that field of consciousness is not just a field of consciousness, it's a field of consciousness, desire, and allurement. And I place my attention, I'm in devotion to my allurement. Because I realize that my unique self is my unique set of allurements, right? And I clarify my allurement. Now stay close. When you distract someone's attention, which is what the postmodern internet does, again, the postmodern internet being the exteriorization of the postmodern interior mind, what the internet does is it distracts you from your allurement. You can't get allured. You can't find your way into your allurement. You can't find your way into your desire. You're constantly distracted. You have to place your attention on your desire. Desire and devotion are inextricably related, right? So I have to place my attention and be in devotion in order to know who I am. So I do need devotion to myself, but not devotion to me as separate self. I'm in devotion to my unique self, and my unique self doesn't separate me from the whole. Unique self is not the coin of alienation. It's not the coin, right, of separation. Unique self is the currency of connection, right? Unique self is the electricity of allurement, right? Unique self is the highway of desire. It's the pathway of desire, right? Right? It's the desire that moves me towards destination, right? And so I need to actually be in devotion to my unique set of allurements, and my allurements allure me to you. Do you get that? My allurements allure me to that which is not merely my separate self, but to you, to she, to my communion, right? With my community, to my communion with teacher, to my communion with family, my communion with beloveds, my communion with the larger field. Homo Amor, right, is actually in communion with the larger whole. I don't only feel my local community, I feel the whole, right? Homo Amor is omni-allured to the whole. And Homo Amor is omni-allured to the whole. Therefore, Homo Amor is omni-responsible for the whole. Therefore, Homo Amor is devoted to the whole. I have a devotion to the whole, which means at a moment of metacrisis, where when I have an experience that the whole is breaking down, then I need to find a way to actually be in service and devotion to the whole. And if we actually come together and realize that only a new story changes the vector of the whole, we might then become devoted, radically devoted, right, to enacting a new story of value for the sake of the whole in mad devotion. Right? Now, that quality of devotion is a unique self playing that. I'm just going to use that as an example. That's an example. I'm a unique self in devotion, but I'm not doing it myself. Right? We're all together in devotion to that vision, and we each have a unique instrument to play in the unique self symphony of that vision of allurement. Right? So devotion means I move from, let's go slow, right? Devotion means I move from, you get this? I move from my unique self, right, being separate. I'm not separate. Uniqueness is the currency of connection. Uniqueness means I have music to play, right? Uniqueness, right? I've got music to play, right? And then, I've got a unique piece of music to play. Now, let's go deep for a second, right? Widening my field, looking at the whole, feeling the whole, right? Allowing myself to take the whole in is beautiful. So if I actually, with intention, right, try and embrace much more of the whole, I move out of my specialization, and I want to take the whole and I become a generalist. And in that sense, I spread my attention around and embrace the whole. That's beautiful. Scattering of attention is something else. It's not a decision I made. It was made for me. And I jump from thing to thing, and I never actually place my attention, right, with any level of depth, right? So on the one hand, I want to expand my attention. On and I want to expand my devotion, and I want to embrace the whole, right? And I want to almost swallow the whole, and yet I want to not scatter, I want to specialize. I want to go deep. I want to read every word, right, that Tolstoy ever wrote, and I want to paint a painting for every one of Shakespeare's sonnets. I'm going to go deep in. And from that place of depth, of devotion to my unique set of allurements, right, I'll actually come and I'll become an artist, and I'll kind of create this new artistry, right, in the great library, and I'll tell a story. So my devotion might be, I'm going to do this particular piece, for example, of the great library that no one else can do. And I'm going to kind of sharpen it and make it noble and beautiful, and right, and I'll do a piece, right, and Elena will do a piece, and right, and Ken Wilbur will do a piece, and Zora will do a piece, right, and in other words, we're going to come together, and Krista will do a piece, right, and Jamie will do a piece, and Jacqueline will do a piece, and Christina Amlon will do a piece, and then she's going to invite Jane to do a piece, and then Shahati, right, to do a piece, and Claire's going to do a piece, and of course, Dr. Kincaid's going to run the entire phenomenology section, right, and kind of that's, wow, that's my allurement. I'm going to do that, and we're going to do that together, right? You begin to see that? It's like, wow, right? So we need to come back to devotion. We need to come back to devotion. We need to reclaim devotion. Devotion to she, right? To the field of Eros. Devotion to the field of Eros as it lives in me. Devotion beyond my egoic and separate self. And sometimes devotion even, I want to stay close with me, even somewhat beyond my unique self sometimes. Sometimes I need to kind of actually evaluate, where are we at this moment in time, and what's my unique contribution at this moment in time? You know, in Israel, when Israel was first established, the land was filled with malaria, and you had doctors coming over from Europe, right, who were like expert doctors and philosophers, and they became farmers. And they became farmers because they were devoted to this vision, right, and that vision required something. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Right? Right. I have a friend whose name I can't say, right, who's a brilliant doctor. Right. And, you know, he was offered, you know, major fellowships in, you know, Western universities, and he returned to Gaza, you know, knowing full well, you know, the horror of Jihad Hamas that was oppressing Gazans. And he returned in order to take a job at a local medical clinic, right, in a particular place in Gaza, because that was his devotion. Right. So he let go of a certain unique self. Right. I often, right, when I feel like, you know, what my, just personally, I can only share personally, when I feel like, wow, what's my unique self? I actually want to write, you know, philosophical poetry about laughter, and philosophical poetry about, you know, all sorts of dimensions of the human experience, right? Story of value, no time for that, right? No, but there's a meta crisis. There's a meta crisis. And what we need to do in a meta crisis is we need to take everything we have and come together in devotion to the whole, and actually articulate and write and share and be together and be in unique self-symphony and be in devotion to each other. Right? The musicians are in devotion, right, to each other, right? Right. And so it's deep. So my unique self has to meet both my unique needs, right, and the unique needs of the moment, right? Both. Does that make sense? I've got to meet both. Okay. Right. And of course, right, the story of value would benefit enormously by the poetry of laughter, and in the poetry of tears. Right. Of course it would. Of course it would. Somehow it all comes together, right, in the paradox. Right. When we hold it all together and we weave it all together, we get wonder and paradox, and we don't get polarity. Right. So what a crazy pleasure, my friends. What a crazy pleasure. What a crazy delight this is to be together.